Welcome to Regional Recovery Follow-Up Fundamentals Module 4, Supplemental DCA Qualifications and RDO Exceptions. In this module, you will learn how to assess need and qualification for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance and the purpose of an RDO Exception Approval, when it is needed, and the approval procedures. Throughout this module, we will use scenario questions to ensure you understand what you have just learned. You will have 10 seconds to think about the question and determine your answer. After 10 seconds, we'll show you the correct answer so you can compare your answer with ours. In order to assess qualifications for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance, you will need to use the Supplemental Direct Client Assistance Qualification and Recommendation Checklist from the Casework and Recovery Planning Standards and Procedures and the Supplemental Direct Client Assistance Roadmap. We will be following the roadmap and the checklist throughout this module. Refer to them when you go through the screening steps with a client. As you have been working with your client, you have offered problem-solving, referrals, information, and advocacy. This support will close the recovery gap for many clients, but there are still those who will be left with a gap we cannot bridge with this support alone. The client may lack funds to purchase an appliance or cover a security deposit. Perhaps the client needs funds for new work tools. Clients with the greatest needs, who earlier received immediate B DCA, may qualify for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance to bridge the recovery gap. The purpose of Supplemental DCA is to provide assistance to support those clients with the greatest needs, those whose recovery roadblocks impact their ability to recover, so they can move forward, bridging their recovery gap. All clients from a regional single and multifamily event level 1 and 2 and disaster operation level 3 events who received immediate B DCA are assessed for Supplemental DCA qualifications, and the recommendation is always documented in CAS. Assessing clients with immediate B DCA and then documenting the recommendation is a required procedure that is a key metric tracked across all regions and used to measure client service quality. Recommendations can only be made after the caseworker has spoken with the client and marked the follow-up successful. If you find any recommendation made before follow-up is successful, delete it and complete the assessment and the recommendation. Let your supervisor know for team and casework mentoring. You can expect about 15% of cases will be those with the greatest needs and qualify for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance during follow-up casework. If the client received immediate A or no DCA, they are not qualified for Supplemental DCA, so there is no need to complete this assessment. No Supplemental DCA recommendation needs to be documented because these clients do not qualify. However, these clients still receive recovery planning, problem-solving, referrals, and advocacy services. The Supplemental DCA recommendation, not qualified, is optional and not part of the necessary workflow. Don't select the Supplemental DCA recommendation, not at this time, because this client's qualification can't change. Supplemental DCA is not authorized for clients in disaster relief operations level 4 and larger. That means those clients are not qualified for Supplemental DCA, except to permit shelter residents to transition out of a shelter. Any change to this standard will be published in a doctrine bulletin for that particular DRO. Your supervisor will brief you in this situation. Now it's time to screen for client needs to see if they are qualified for Supplemental DCA. If the client received immediate B, do they have a documented recovery gap? If so, you need to add or determine the one recovery gap that is essential to their recovery progress, and that there are no other resources available to fill the gap. For instance, you may have been able to provide referrals for your client's appliance, and the client is working with the landlord to get the security deposit, but the client is unable to pay for moving expenses. In this case, you select moving expenses as the one recovery gap and then continue with the screening. If all identified recovery gaps have been met with referrals or other means, select the Supplemental DCA recommendation, not at this time. If another recovery gap comes up in the next few days or weeks, a caseworker could change the recommendation. Remember Miss Jones, whose apartment building had a fire? In the case of Miss Jones, we learn that her apartment building has been condemned. She has found long-term housing, but is struggling with finances to pay the security deposit and first month's rent. Let's continue to assess Miss Jones for Supplemental DCA qualification. Let's continue walking through the steps on the Supplemental DCA roadmap. We need to verify that all other resources have been exhausted to meet the identified recovery gap. Personal resources are depleted. Has the client depleted all personal resources to address this recovery gap? This does not mean they have no money, just that they are not able to cover the gap with their current budget. Personal resources mean the resources the client can access through their own network, family, insurance, employer, faith-based group, or other assistance program. If they have not depleted personal resources, the client does not qualify, and you can record the outcome as not at this time in CAS 2.0. Insufficient community assistance. Are community partner referrals insufficient, or recovery gap cannot be addressed by referrals? If the answer is no, you should refer the client to community partners and document the referrals. In later follow-up conversations, it may be determined that the partners were not able to meet the need, in which case the client may then qualify. If the need is filled by the partner organization, then the client does not qualify, and you mark the Supplemental DCA recommendation not at this time. If there is no community resource to meet this need, document this in CAS with yes and continue with assessing qualification. If yes, one or more referrals need to be documented on the follow-up tab or a narrative note that there are no referral resources for this need. Give the client a chance to work with the referrals organization to see if that group can meet the need. Note in the narrative the need the client wanted to fill with each referral. Set follow-up date on follow-up tab and check back with the client. If the answer is no to either or both of these questions, document the answers and then select not at this time in the Supplemental DCA recommendation, and then continue with follow-up recovery planning. We have learned from Ms. Jones that her insurance is not able to provide her with the funds she needs for her long-term housing, and the returned rent from her current landlord is insufficient to cover the security deposit and first month's rent. She has depleted all of her personal resources, and no additional referrals are available to provide support. Let's continue to assess Ms. Jones. Next, does the client have 2 or more recovery roadblocks? These are the conditions or situations that can complicate recovery. These can be financial or household situations. A minimum of 2 roadblocks must be selected in CAS for the family to qualify for supplemental assistance. Financial roadblocks include current living expenses unsustainable, impacts not covered by insurance, serious loss of income or employment, government assistance is inadequate. Household roadblocks include disaster health services confirmed health condition, disaster mental health confirmed recovery roadblock. As a reminder, DHS, DMH confirmed roadblocks will be documented in CAS 2.0 under the Case Review tab, where the HS DMH approver name will be entered, along with a narrative note. No confidential information would be included, just that there is a confirmed condition. Disability or access functional need. Need support reading or speaking English. Child 5 years of age or younger. Primary client is over 70 years of age and will not return to live in pre-disaster residence. If 2 or more roadblocks have not been checked, the client does not have 2 or more roadblocks. Select Not at this time in the Supplemental DCA recommendation option, and then continue with follow-up recovery planning. If the answer is yes, there are 2 or more roadblocks, and all other standards are met, you are ready to recommend supplemental assistance in CAS 2.0. Let's look at our scenario with Ms. Jones. We learned that Ms. Jones's apartment building was condemned by an emergency management agency, so she will not be returning to the pre-disaster housing. She has found a new long-term living situation, but it is in the next town over. She is unable to pay the security deposit or first month's rent. We also know that Ms. Jones has a baby and a 4-year-old daughter. If the client does not have 2 or more roadblocks, select Not at this time in the Supplemental DCA recommendation option, and then continue with follow-up recovery planning. If there are 2 or more roadblocks, as it is for Ms. Jones, you are ready to recommend Supplemental Assistance in CAS 2.0. Next, you need to select your recommendation. When selecting a Supplemental DCA recommendation, you have several recommendation options. If the client is qualified, you will select option A, B, or C. The options are the amounts listed on the Direct Client Assistance price list. The amount you select is the amount that will cover the gap. The option may be somewhat more, but not less than the cost of the recovery gap need. Like all types of DCA, Supplemental DCA options A, B, or C are provided to the primary client on the same CAC if the client still has the original card. You may provide and activate a new CAC if the card was lost or the card load limits have been reached. If the client did not meet the qualifications such as not having 2 or more roadblocks, or referrals are available to meet the need, select the recommendation Not at this time. After you make your recommendation for Supplemental DCA in CAS 2.0, follow local procedures to bring the recommendation to a supervisor who will review the narrative and all the qualification answers to make sure they are all complete. If they are all yes, then the supplemental assistance will be approved. If not, the supplemental recommendation will be declined. Once the outcome is determined, your supervisor will document approved or declined in CAS 2.0 and make a narrative note. The supervisor will follow local procedures to communicate that decision back to you. The follow-up priority field can be set to high when you need to track a case carefully. If approved, you will then select Reload and the fast-tracked item DCA3 Supplemental Assistance option to add value to the original CAC the client received for the immediate DCA provided at the time of their initial interview. If the client lost the original CAC, or if the total direct client assistance provided for all types of assistance will be more than $1,500, then you will need to issue a new CAC for Red Cross to provide to the client in person. In the rare situation that a second in-person meeting with the client to deliver the replacement card is not possible, the unactivated card may be mailed to the client and activated when the client calls Red Cross after receiving it. If the supervisor declines the supplemental recommendation, you will need to communicate that to the client and be ready to provide additional referrals and advocate for the client with other organizations if requested. There are circumstances that will require a RDO exception when you are recommending supplemental DCA. You could request approval for a variety of reasons. Understand that the decision is up to the RDO or the designee. You may request a RDO exception approval for supplemental DCA if a client lost the CAC that still has a balance and you need to add supplemental DCA to the account. Your client has an unusual recovery gap and otherwise qualifies for supplemental DCA. You need to expand the time frame to make a supplemental DCA recommendation more than 30 days after case creation. Or you need to expand assistance beyond the DCA price list standard for supplemental C. For example, the client's recovery gap need cost $400. The client needs to build a ramp for a family member's wheelchair to access the home. The client could receive supplemental C, and the balance is RDO Exception 3 Supplemental. This case requires both supervisor approval for the supplemental assistance and RDO Exception approval for the additional RDO Exception Supplemental Assistance. As you learned in Module 2, if you need to request a RDO exception for supplemental assistance, Complete the assessment and qualifications as you would normally do, and then make a note in the case narrative and notify a supervisor who will review the case and request the Regional Disaster Officer exception. If the exception is for an unusual recovery gap, explain the gap in the narrative notes. Once the request has been approved or denied, the RDO will approve or decline verbally or by email. When approved, you can load the client's card using the RDO Exception Fast-Tracked Item DCA 5 RDO Exception, and then select RDO Exception 3, Supplemental, and enter the approved amount. The RDO will then document the decision along with a RDO exception note and check which RDO exception was requested and the approver's name in CAS 2.0 within 24 hours. For a rare RDO exception to provide an amount above the price list options, the supervisor may approve Supplemental C and then request a Regional Disaster Officer exception for the additional assistance needed to meet the gap. For example, the client has a need for $500. You may recommend Supplemental DCA Option C for $300. Make a narrative note to request RDO Exception Supplemental for $200 more and the reason. When you have RDO approval, select RDO Exception 3, Supplemental, under RDO Exceptions and provide the additional $200. For a DRO event, the DRO Director assumes responsibility for Regional Disaster Officer exceptions. You have now learned each of the steps in the Supplemental DCA roadmap. Let's try each step with some client scenarios. We will show the same scenario on the following 3 slides so you always have the details available. Mr. Ming is ready to move to a new apartment in the same complex. He spent his last funds to transfer his electric account. He needs help with moving. He had surgery recently and can't move by himself. Truck rental cost $145, and he has found 2 guys he can pay $150 to move his belongings. No community assistance is available. Mr. Ming, the primary client, is over 70 years and needs support reading or speaking English. His total recovery gap is $295. Does Mr. Ming have a recovery gap? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Ming's moving expense is a recovery gap. Are personal resources depleted and is community assistance insufficient? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Ming's personal resources are depleted and community assistance is insufficient. Does Mr. Ming have 2 or more recovery roadblocks? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Ming, the primary client, is over 70 and he needs support reading and speaking English. What is your recommendation for SDCA? The correct answer is option C, $300. Mr. Ming qualifies for Supplemental DCA option C, $300 because he has a recovery gap. Personal resources are depleted, there is insufficient community assistance, and he has 2 recovery roadblocks. Now, let's walk through another scenario where we will assess qualifications for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance and then make a recommendation. We will show the same scenario on the following 3 slides so you always have the details available. Ms. Garcia is single and needs to get back to work as a chef. She is required to supply her own knives and uniforms, which were destroyed in the fire and cost $350 to replace. She is not insured. She has raised $150, but needs the remaining $200. No other organization is able to assist. Does Ms. Garcia have a recovery gap? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Ms. Garcia's occupational need is a recovery gap. Are personal resources depleted and is community assistance insufficient? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Ms. Garcia's personal resources are depleted and community assistance is insufficient. Does Ms. Garcia have 2 or more recovery roadblocks? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Ms. Garcia's impacts are not covered by insurance, and she has a serious loss of income or employment. What is your recommendation for SDCA? The correct answer is option B. Ms. Garcia meets all the qualifications for Supplemental DCA option B, $200. Now let's walk through another scenario where we will assess qualifications for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance and then make a recommendation. We will show the same scenario on the following 3 slides so you always have the details available. A tree has now been removed from Mr. Mitchell's uninsured home. He has repaired the damaged roof and walls. He is out of money and needs to replace the electrical panel to restore power. Mr. Mitchell found a local electrician through his church to donate the labor, but needs to buy the electrical supplies for $225. Mr. Mitchell, his wife, and their teen son can then return home. Does Mr. Mitchell have a recovery gap? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Mitchell's home repair need is a recovery gap. Are personal resources depleted and is community assistance insufficient? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Mitchell's personal resources are depleted and community assistance is insufficient. Does Mr. Mitchell have 2 or more recovery roadblocks? Yes or no? The correct answer is no. Mr. Mitchell's impacts are not covered by insurance, but he does not have a second recovery roadblock at this time. What is your recommendation for SDCA? The correct answer is not at this time. Continue to help the client find a community resource that can meet the need. If you find there is a second recovery roadblock and the client still has the recovery gap, you can change the recommendation at that time. Now, let's walk through another scenario where we will assess qualifications for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance and then make a recommendation. We will show the same scenario on the following 3 slides so you always have the details available. Mr. Khan found a new home to rent. To safely live in the home, he needs to install bathroom grab bars for a disabled family member. Mr. Khan lost his job recently and is barely able to cover their bills. No organization is available to meet this need. He says the materials and installation will cost $92. Does Mr. Khan have a recovery gap? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Khan's home repair need is a recovery gap. Are personal resources depleted and is community assistance insufficient? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Khan's personal resources are depleted and community assistance is insufficient. Does Mr. Khan have 2 or more recovery roadblocks? Yes or no? The correct answer is yes. Mr. Khan will not return to live into pre-disaster residence, and there is a member of the household that has a disability or access and functional need. What is your recommendation for SDCA? The correct answer is option A. Mr. Khan meets all of the qualifications for Supplemental DCA Option A, $100. Your casework supervisor has the authority to approve a Supplemental DCA recommendation made within 30 days of opening the case. What if the caseworker makes the supplemental recommendation more than 30 days from the initial interview? If the supplemental recommendation is made more than 30 days after the case creation, a caseworker or supervisor may request a RDO exception to extend the time frame for approval. All other qualifications for supplemental assistance still apply. The RDO or designee and the supervisor must record the approvals and the exception note under the Case Review tab within 24 hours. Great job! This concludes Module 4, Supplemental DCA Qualifications and RDO Exceptions, where you learned how to assess need and qualification for Supplemental Direct Client Assistance and the purpose of an RDO exception approval, when it is needed, and the approval procedures. You are now ready for Module 5, Document and Wrap Up, where you will learn the importance of documenting client and event information for follow-up in CAS 2.0 and how to accurately use the Narrative and Documentation Guide job tool. You will also learn about the final steps when wrapping up with the client. The following slide contains photo credits.